Hi, I wanted to begin by thanking you for this invitation to speak, in particular, thanking Chris for handling the invitation, and for your willingness to have such an unusual format for a speaker. Hopefully, over time, as technology progresses and our acceptance of it happens, we will do more and more talks like this. And that's something I'm actually going to speak to during my talk. But I should begin by unabashedly acknowledging that my title, Climate Humanist, is not my own, but stolen, borrowed, from Wai-Chi Dimmock, who is actually the editor of PMLA. MLA, of course, Modern Language Association, is the big organization that myself and other people in the humanities are a member of, and their publication is PMLA. And as editor, Wai-Chi is writing an article that, it's my understanding, will appear early in 2018, talking about climate humanists, which will feature the work of a number of folks in the field, people like Peter Sachs at Harvard, Bethany Wiggins at Penn, and myself. It's an interesting departure, insofar as, we've just gotten to the point where our profession, what we do, is generally referred to as the environmental humanities, and now to talk about it as climate humanities is different. I think it's perfectly warranted, however. So, in my specific field, in environmental criticism, we often talk about different waves of environmental criticism. The first wave, which took place in the really this fourth quarter of the 20th century, and then a second wave which came along early in the 21st century, and people now talk about third or fourth waves and all. And it's to distinguish that something really different is happening. And I think by talking about climate humanities, it's that same acknowledgement that this is new. I mean, I guess technically you could subsume it all under the environmental humanities and make it just sort of a subset. But it's really, I think, more useful to talk about climate somewhat separately. And in fact, at UC Santa Barbara, where I teach, colleagues like John Ford and I are working to set up a EJCJ hub, an environmental justice, climate justice hub, that acknowledges that these are somewhat different things, in that environmental justice, for example, which begins again in the fourth quarter of the 20th century, often has preoccupations with things like point source pollution, often local or regional issues, whereas climate justice, of course, is a global issue that looks very different. And I think it's fair to say, and I think Wai-Chi is right, that in humanities, climate humanities are something that we have to think about a little differently, and I think, simply welcome as an important intervention by scholars. Okay, well, my talk proper, I'd like to start with a rather strong statement. The world we live in has largely been written into being. This observation is coming out of a long line of 20th century thinking that really begins with folks like Martin Heidegger, and Wittgenstein as well. And the realization that culture is so incredibly important to understanding human experience and human thought. That sounds like a self-evident, almost like a tautological thing to say, that culture is important to understand. But for a long time in the history of philosophy, there was this notion that we could stand separate and apart from culture and in some trans-historical way talk about the whole of the human experience without focusing in on particular cultures, specific moments in time, specific places. In the 20th century, of course, there was a great movement away from that. Heidegger is interesting, especially because in his own thinking, of course, there was a great shift that took place. And in his later thinking, he realized and propounded that language was so essential to understanding the human experience and what we think. In fact, he very famously, and his personal copy of Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, where he had talked about non-discursive practices as being sort of primary and important. Later, after he had given the matter some thought for a few decades, he very famously wrote in his own personal copy in the margin, he put, "False language is the primordial essence of being." And what he meant by that, of course, is that as a social being, as social creatures, we human beings are connected first by way of a range of practices, many of them that do not show up in language. And that was, of course, one of Wittgenstein's great observations in the philosophical investigation, that, you know, a culture could exist, and he has it sort of taking place at a workspace where people are working, that could exist without ever, you know, language intervening. Well, that's true enough, but Heidegger came to see later in life and began to argue that it is really language in the sense of the cultural practices that are united by way of what we've written down. And I'll talk about this in a little detail. That's really the basis of my talk. That's really what's important. It is how all this exists in language, through language, by way of language. That would, of course, be taken up very famously in the third quarter of the 20th century by Michel Foucault and others, probably most famously and certainly most influentially by Foucault, who would make an actual historical study of these sort of changes in culture and the way that they've shown up in language. Doesn't mean that, again, that these things can't operate on a level that is not discursive necessarily, but language is so very important. And the third figure, or fourth figure I'd invoke here, is a young scholar at the closing quarter of the 20th century who reads Foucault, and that's Stephen Greenblatt. And he inaugurates a critical movement in literary study, especially known as New Historicism. I should out myself at the onset that Stephen Greenblatt was one of my dissertation advisors, so I am sympathetic to the project. But what Greenblatt realized, following the footsteps of Foucault, who was in fact following the footsteps of Heidegger, is that if we can understand a great deal about a culture by what it has written and what it has put down, and this puts the author in an interesting position, not only as the sort of person who chronicles culture by writing it down, and in a way, historically, we can learn a great deal about a culture by seeing how it works, and people who are good at chronicling it are very important. But it's also the case that writers do not, good writers, great writers, influential writers, do not just write down what is happening in their culture. They push it forward. Heidegger very famously, in an essay on the German Romantic poet Hölderlin, talked about this as sort of writers running out ahead of the rest of us and imagining a new kind of world and writing that into being. You can see, going back to my original statement, that we live in a world largely written into being, how this insight is so central. So Greenblatt, and he wasn't the only one, of course, there were a number of critics at the time, realized that so many aspects of culture had been written into being, and alternately, or I guess with that, dovetailing with it, they could be written out of being, and at the very least we could look at how they were working and how this writing was so influential. So what do I mean by all this? I'll give an example coming out of that era that gave birth to New Historicism in the 1970s. And there would be, a number of examples. The feminist movement, feminist criticism, Marxist criticism focusing on class. These movements were incredibly influential because they were able to tie in to concerns about the way culture worked. So, feminist critics would look at texts, first off, things like Jane Eyre, maybe, The Brontes are good examples. So is Jane Austen. And look at patriarchy and misogyny at work and try both to understand it at the period, and sort of in that sense, seeing how these texts chronicled it, as well as how important writers sort of drew attention to it and drew attention to need for change as well. And Raymond Williams, another critic at the time, focused on this dynamic not as a function of feminist concerns, but it's the way class worked and the way class structure worked, especially the proletariat, and not just an urban proletariat, but one of Williams' great insight was that rural farm workers as well as sort of a type of proletariat. So what this does is it empowers thinkers to look at the way that culture works. And one of the easiest ways we can see that in the greatest detail is in the writings that a culture produces. So by looking at those writings very carefully, we can understand that world. But going further, and this goes to my opening statement, we can see how that world is written into being. That it is not it doesn't work entirely by way of practices that are non-discursive, things that we never say. It does work that way, and I've talked about this before, and I'll give a little example to show how it ties into language and the importance of writing in particular. And that is, many years ago, I happened to be walking down a street in Philadelphia, and I was behind a mother and a small child. And the street we were walking down was a neighborhood where there were a diverse group of individuals passing as we walked. And it was fascinating to watch the response of the woman ahead of me to the different type of people that passed. So I noticed that when couples passed, people with children, her demeanor, her position was very different, was very calm and basically not affected by what she saw. Sometimes when it was just two or one man or three men, I noticed her becoming noticeably more tense. But I especially noticed when she saw people of color, especially men passing, she became noticeably more tense, very tense. And it occurred to me that what I was witnessing was racial tension, not operating on the level of language, but on a bodily level. When I saw her body tense when she encountered people of different races, it was fascinating to see how that racial tension was literally communicated to her child, because all this was not lost on this child who when things like this happened, and from my vantage point I could see it, looked up at her mother, looked carefully to see what was going on, why her hand had suddenly gotten more tense, why it was holding her tighter. And over time, I imagine, although I didn't quite see it at work, that racial tension would be communicated down this woman's arm into the hand of that little body, who would feel that tension as well, who would understand, although nothing had been said, not a single word had been uttered, that people of different races were, as understood by the mother, of concern and should be thought of differently and should invoke a kind of fear. I was struck by this, I have to admit, because I had always thought that language is how things like racial tension are communicated. And it became very clear to me at the time that it's not that way, and what makes those dispositions so durable, to sort of riff on a Foucault phrase, is that they don't rise up to the level of language necessarily. So this parent could have not thought of herself in any way as a racist, could have in every way communicated that to her child, saying that she thought of all people, similarly, and that racism was a bad thing. fair enough. But it doesn't mean that racial tension wouldn't have been communicated otherwise, and that sort of racial tension, because it never rises up to the level of language, wouldn't have persisted in a very durable way that would be hard to address, much less change. But in any event, it's clear to me that while that's at work and something that we need to address because it means that we aren't always accessing the root feelings, and those feelings again may not have a direct beginning in language. They're still there. So if you think about this for a moment, I think it's clear that a lot of culture is written into being. Let me explain further by giving an example that has to do with the climate humanities. We may think that the culture that we're born in is a very normal one. I think everyone does. Heidegger had that insight as well. His idea was Dasein, of course. You're thrown into a culture at birth, and that culture becomes normal. You tend not to think about it because it becomes the sort of standard backdrop of your life, and you tend to focus on the foreground of your life, all those things happening, and not the backdrop. But it is the case that those backdrop practices are so incredibly important. So when we're born into a world, when I was born into a world, when everyone listening to this was born into a world, that world had automobiles as a conspicuous feature. Uh, it they are ubiquitous. They're part of our lives. They're how we get around. Um, but it is the case that that culture is not natural in the sense that it's something transhistorical or anything like that. In fact, it's created. That culture was not just created, but written into being. Now, as to why that happened, we can look at. You could go back very far to even before the introduction of the automobile at the close of the 19th century. You could go back to the notion that we need to move faster in time, and I'm not just talking about trains and all, omnibus in the 1830s in Europe and in the United States. You go back to all that. But I think the most interesting dynamic and historical moment that really puts the car at the forefront of American culture happened considerably later. And we can give a very quick synopsis of what happened, and that is, of course, that in the 1930s, the United States and the world was in, of course, a massive worldwide depression. What brought us out of that, in very simple terms, is the Second World War and the massive industrial buildup that happened, and especially in the United States. I think it's almost hard to imagine that kind of industrial buildup happening so quickly and on so large a scale. It was just extraordinary. That brought us out of the Depression. But then the question, the $1,000,000, and it's really even back then, I think, maybe even a $1,000,000,000 question, is what would sustain the American culture, American economy after that? The answer soon came on the scene, and that is the automobile industry. In the 1950s, that industry, coming out of the industrial infrastructure that was set up during the Second World War. By the 1950s, 70% of all automobiles in the world were coming from the United States. And by 1960, 1 in 6 Americans, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, was employed by the automobile industry. And it goes hand in hand, too, with the road building juggernaut. Eisenhower wrote a single bill into being that called for the creation of over 40,000 miles of highways. But how did that happen? How was that sold on the American public? I would argue that was written into being. It was written into being in a thousand ways. Of course, in advertisement, pushing the importance of the car. Famously that there would be a car in every garage, and then very quickly, and wonderful works by folks like Vance Packard dating back to this era. Packard's the waste makers, documenting how the industry realized very quickly they needed two cars in every garage, and they needed to sell the automobile not just on what was at the time men, but women as well, and how that happened. But all this was carefully scripted insofar as it was planned, it was communicated, it was discussed, but it was written in advertisements. Sure, that was a big part of it, but also written into being in the way government policies, laws, regulations, support, subsidies were done. Um, if you wanted to go back, and I would urge a generation of scholars to do this with issues like the automobile, you could see how this is written into being, depending on how closely you wanted to look at this archive. And it's a vast archive. And again, it can be something like a government document, or it could be something like an advertisement, the script for a television advertisement, or the layout for a magazine advertisement. All this is how this particular culture emerged in the United States. It's more complicated than that. So back in the era of the omnibus and sort of large carriages pulled by horses, in the United States, the growth of suburbia was beginning to take place in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. That is kind of overshadowed by what happened after the Second World War and the birth of Levittowns and similar large-scale housing developments, which dominated the second half of the 20th century in the United States. That goes hand in hand with the automobile, of course, because why did we need all these automobiles? If everyone lived in a city in the sort of densely populated areas of a place like Manhattan, it would be absurd to own a car, and you couldn't sell anyone on it. But suburbia has to go hand in hand with that. So what I'm suggesting is that cultural historians like myself, literary historians like myself, need to fundamentally change the approach that we've had and begin looking at these cultural practices in great detail. The creation of car culture, the creation of suburbs and their culture. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, we can go back to and ask that question of the Marxist and feminist critics in the 60s and 70s. Why would you want to draw attention to that? Well, this goes back even further, I think, to Heidegger, who realized that if you could draw attention to the workings of culture, you would have the possibility of not only pulling back the veil and showing that these practices that were born into at birth, that were thrown into, that we take for granted, that these in fact are decisions that were made long ago, and more importantly, that you could disrupt culture by drawing attention to this. That's what the feminist critics, thinkers, were doing in the 1970s. They were drawing attention to all these cultural practices that were so disturbing. They're patriarchal or out and out misogynistic. By drawing attention to those practices, and just by drawing attention to them, just by pulling aside the veil and showing how these things had been written into being, examining carefully the texts that were even then carefully policing that culture by writing it into being again and again and propounding the importance of patriarchy. Just by drawing attention to that, you have the potential to disrupt that culture. I think we need to do the same with a range of cultural practices that now seem as natural as patriarchy, but have profound environmental and specifically in terms of global anthropogenic climate change implications. So the automobile is one example of that, and the culture around it. We need to carefully look at that and to make clear that it was a created culture, and its creation was of a certain era, and the people behind it, people like Robert Moses, who wrote the New York metropolitan culture into being and had massive influence across the United States. That needs to be looked at carefully. And again, why we want to do that is to reveal that the choices that we've made were in fact choices. The culture that we have was in fact created, and we have the ability to create a new culture, a very different one. I say this because I'm not sure otherwise how we get out of problems like automobile culture. You know, People like Elon Musk have sort of, come, come riding in like a knight on a horse, saying that he will solve the problem of the automobile in this, whiz-bang new technological way by giving us a car that is emission-free. Well, that's not actually accurate. Emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, for something like a Tesla are enormous just to create it. On average, there are 3 years of emissions that go into the creation of a car before you drive it. And of course, how you source the electricity that you're using for your Tesla makes a big difference. Beyond that, then there's the life afterwards, and all the lithium that's mined for the batteries in that car has to be done as well, taken into account as well. And the fact is, there's no way that 8 billion people, we're soon going to, approach that as a global population. No way that 8 billion people can all drive automobiles. And as a consequence, the radical, disruptive thinkers of our era are not thinking like Elon Musk. And in a way, as fascinating a character as he paints, it's all kind of business as usual. And what I mean by that is, he's arguing that we should be driving 5,000-pound vehicles, and we know statistically that 3 out of 4 cars on the road are carrying just one person. A massive 5,000-pound vehicle to transport just one person, and that aside from not making much sense and being a very dangerous practice, the WHO, the World Health Organization, now calls automobile accidents a global epidemic, killing more than 1 million people a year, and somewhere between 20 and 50 million getting seriously injured in all these accidents. But there must be a better way. So to get to that better way, I think what we first need to do is look at that practice very carefully and understand how it came into being. Reveal that it's just one road that was taken, 70 years ago for the most part, and then look at new ways, new roads that can be written into being. But there probably won't be new roads in the sense of we have all this infrastructure, all these roads that were built. I think we're going to utilize them. As to what this can be like, I think ahead of the curve already are city planners who are already imagining worlds where the car is phased out. If we are going to meet those very ambitious, some would say unrealistically ambitious goals of the 2015 COP, the Paris Accord, if we're going to meet that, we're going to have to phase out certainly internal combustion engines burning fossil fuels, but beyond that, probably the automobile as well, and I mean completely phase it out. It certainly has to be reduced. And if you look at the cities that are doing this already, they are using existing infrastructure in terms of roads and all, and putting in bicycle routes, for example. If you look at something like Vancouver, they've been very successful now. In 2016, they had already reached a goal that they had imagined for somewhat later, which is that 50% of the population would be walking or biking or using mass transit to get to work every day. That kind of culture can be written into being as well. And that's what I find so interesting, and that's why I start with this notion that a world is written into being, can be written into being, that our world was written into being, and that we can write a new world into being, that we can write into being a world And this I mean not just scholars. Scholars might draw attention to the need and all, but it's the city planners, it's the people that ride those bicycles, the people riding this new uh, um, wave of electric hybrid bicycles, pedal electric hybrids, that are riding into a new world, that are riding this experience into being. And now, of course, that's disseminated electronically through the World Wide Web, where this new culture, we can see it beginning to emerge, and we can see it being written into being. Now, whether it succeeds or not, and where it succeeds, that's a fascinating issue, and as a cultural historian, that interests me greatly. But the fact is, it needs to happen. Needs to happen. And coming back to this notion of climate humanists, um, this has to be understood as primarily a concern of the social sciences and humanities, and not just the natural sciences and technology. People represented by like Elon Musk, and not to use him as a straw man and be yet again critical, but if you approach this just from a technological point of view, which ostensibly is what someone like Musk is doing, you will only come up with technological solutions. You will come up with a car that is cleaner. Well, sure, it doesn't produce any emissions itself directly, although it can be, depending on where its electricity is sourced, responsible for a great deal of emissions. Beyond that, it's a limited approach to the problem, because it's just approaching it technologically. It's not looking at the fact that great, not technological changes are needed, but great cultural changes are needed. And to affect that, we need to understand the culture that we've been thrown into at birth, um, and we need to disrupt that. We need to say that cars are not just natural, that they were written into being in the American landscape. As striking as that seems, they're out there driving around, but before that could happen, we as Americans needed to be sold on the idea that we needed them, and that's a hard sell, right? I mean, AAA notes that roughly $9,000 a year is needed for the maintenance and owning of an automobile. How do you convince Americans to spend that kind of money? If you consider that as after-tax income, you need to make something like 60 or 70,000. If you make 60 or $70,000 a year, one day of your work week, every Monday you go in and work for one thing and one thing alone, which is to own and operate an automobile. That makes great sense for the American economy, and you can see why it was pushed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and after, as so important for the American economy, because obviously the automobile industry was easily, far and away, the largest industry that we had. But now we have to look at that industry and automobiles in a very different light in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that, we need to look at culture rather than cars themselves. Self-driving cars aren't going to solve any of this. Electric cars aren't going to really help much either. We need to end that culture. There are a range of cultural practices like this, and again, we may think that the solutions that are needed are things like or technological solutions, but food systems, for example, it's mostly cultural, right? The fact that we consume so incredibly much meat, the fact that we have so much waste, these part technological, I suppose, but for the most part, it needs to be a change in cultural practices. That in addition to not driving cars and riding, walking around, or riding bikes or e-bikes, that maybe we need to move to more that we in fact do need to move to a more plant-based diet. Now, to many people hearing this, certainly I imagine in different parts of the United States, they would be frustrated by this notion that I'm suggesting we get rid of cars and we start, all becoming vegetarian or vegans. And I, of course, would go much further and argue that we need to get rid of airplanes too, and that we need to get rid of big houses, certainly trophy houses, and we might actually not go in the direction of micro houses or apartments or something, but to something like eco villages, where we look at the possibility of more communal living, where instead of us living in an imagined future of tiny little apartments or houses, that we all whole families, many of them, live together, communally sharing kitchens and meals and a whole range of different practices. That's all going to sound strange, I think, to some folks, because it is very different than the world in which we were born into, which has cars and big houses and lots of meat and all sorts of things. But we need to change that. It's just the way it is. It is simply not sustainable. But you can see with just changes to cultural practices that we can actually reach the goals, the very ambitious goals of the Paris Accord. Um, it's not going to take a whole range of new electric cars. It's so much simpler. Get rid of your car. Go to a place where you don't need a car and it's more environmentally sound to begin with, which would be cities. That's happening already as a cultural movement, and we should certainly encourage it. Over half the world's population now lives in cities. By mid-century, it'll be three-quarters of the population. By the end of the century, 85% or more of the people on this planet will live in cities. And certainly this great social experiment of the 20th century, suburbs, which I think will be seen as one of the great social experiments and one of the great failed experiments, maybe even eclipsing, the large totalitarian socialist experiments of the 20th century, and that's fascinating to think about. We just haven't thought of it that way because, or most of us haven't thought of it that way because we're still in the middle of that experiment. We haven't pulled free of that way of thinking, of that suite of cultural practices. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is quite simply that that not only is the world that we live in largely written into being, but that we can write a new world into being as well. This is not at root an issue for the natural sciences, but again, for folks like me in the humanities, because we're in a position to understand culture. Social sciences, of course, are working hand in hand with us in doing this. But why we climate humanists need to be on the scene is that we have a suite of tools that have been developing for over a century, which is why I pushed back to 100 years ago to the beginning of the 20th century with Heidegger, that we've been developing those tools for understanding culture. And moreover, there have been activists among us for decades now. And again, I'm looking back to early feminist activists, in the sense of literary critics who were feminists, who were very intent on trying to unmask the way our culture worked in a way that was, simply, disadvantageous and, to be honest, horrible to women. We need to do that as well. And I guess maybe my talk is meant to be that sort of, not a call to arms, that would be the wrong metaphor here, but it's meant to urge a new generation of thinkers, of people in the humanities, to look carefully at climate to see what our intervention can be. And I think that intervention has simply been insufficient so far. And why I say that, again going back to my theme here, is that we can have a huge intervention. We can intervene in a way that would just not only eclipse but make what Elon Musk does seem as minuscule, because it is. He's making no cultural change. He is not going to bring about significant greenhouse gas emissions. Uh, Maybe maybe he will, in the sense of it'll be half or a third of what it was before. But we can eradicate this. We can drive it into the ground by changing cultural practices. We can literally, be a species that can exist on the planet with greenhouse gas emissions less than 1 metric ton per person. Put that in perspective, if you're not familiar with the numbers, that's a tenth of what the average American does today. We're in a position to do that right now. It's not going to take some new type of atomic power fusion. It's not going to take new battery technology, new battery gigafactories. It's not going to take any of that. It is going to take cold, cold is the wrong word. It's going to take a focused look at culture, how it works, why it works the way it does, why it's not working for us today, and an intervention, a shift of that culture into something new. That to me is enormously exciting. Naomi Klein's a really useful book from a couple of years ago, This Changes Everything. In that, Klein says that this is an exciting moment for us, and it is exciting because it means not only that we're, in a position to radically change our world, but we can address other issues as well. The enormous disparity of wealth on the planet, and the living conditions under which billions of people live today. We can address all that, but all these are cultural changes. But it's so exciting to think about that we're in an era where in the humanities, before people like Stephen Greenblatt and his era of critics came along, in the humanities, in my field, literary studies, we looked at poems and talked about their meter and their rhyme scheme and metaphor and things like that. How unimportant that seems in a way. I mean, it's still important, sure, but how unimportant compared to the sort of cultural intervention that we can make. That not only can we draw attention to the fact that the world has been written into being, largely so, and how that was done, we can take a stab at writing a new world into being, or at least suggesting how that can be done. That to me is so exciting. And, maybe if I were into making, lithium-ion batteries, I would find that exciting too. But I find this every bit as exciting, every bit as important. All right, if I'm really honest, I find it more exciting, and I would argue it's even more important. So I'll leave you with that thought. And again, I'm very grateful and thankful that you had me speak today. Take care.